One of the things I want to impress on you, and some people have already done this, is that floras are never static. And in fact, when you study biogeography, you learn this, that floras march all over the planet. So there's always been shifts in structure and composition in floras, but actually the rate of current change is probably unprecedented. And this is largely facilitated by activities of humans, whether intentional or not. And so change, and that's just the way things are. That's my mother. A great California philosopher. Current floristic changes are associated with invasion of non-indigenous species. And so, every time I talk about invasive species, I have to sort of define what I'm talking about. And an invasion involves several stages. The first stage is transport. And this is when an alien species is introduced through human activities, whether intentional, as in the horticultural trade, or by species hitchhiking on, in seeds like Zusine stratomatica. The second stage would be establishment. That means that where they first were introduced, they start reproducing, but they don't spread yet, because spread is the third stage. And once it spreads from the initial site, that's when we call it invasive. Now, some people take it a little bit further than that and talk about impact. And I'm not going to talk about that, because impacts can be very subtle. There can be no impacts, and there can be obviously tremendous impacts, as we learned about Mauritius and strawberry guava. So impacts is a nebulous ecological issue, and it's also a political one. And so I'm going to dance around that and avoid talking about some impacts. Well, the process of invasion is often facilitated by native species. So here's an example. Our lovely African tulip tree, Spathodia, and this happens to be on the Caribbean Netherlands island of Saba. And the native banana quit is over there having a grand old time. There's lots of nectar in these things, and there's poking its head in there, getting dusted with pollen. And I would imagine is performing some pollinator services. And given the plethora of fruit set on these trees, they're probably pretty good at it. So this invasion facilitation also occurs with orchids, and but orchids are actually very underrepresented amongst the invasive species pool, as Kurt Dahler had written about some years ago. And it turns out that who is invasive is a phylogenetically very diverse group. You can see the numbers right there. And this also includes horticultural hybrids. And so we're not just talking about species, we're talking about, well, one of the oldest ones is Epidendrum o'brienianum. I forget what the species are involved in that, but that's been invasive and naturalized in Hawaii for a long time. Okay, so the question is, why aren't there more orchids? Considering the high dispersal capabilities of these things, they do produce numerous dust-like seeds. Oh, we know all about this. And the habitats are often ephemeral. A good example of that is, 3/4 of the species, someone said 3/4, so I'll pick up on that number. 3/4 of the species are epiphytes. And, in epiphytes, got to get the middle one. Can't even see it. Epiphytes, the host trees, they grow. Trees grow. And as they grow, the architecture changes. Branches are shed, plants are lost. So it's a very ephemeral kind of habitat, even on big trees. And then also that we find that some species, at least, show some metapopulation dynamics. Populations go extinct. In fact, Hannah was talking about senility in populations, and that's basically what the metapopulation dynamics is saying. Well, the explanation for why not more invasives is that we have our own dogma, and when dogma bites, it doesn't let go. And our dogma is that we have orchids that are just wonderfully specialized. So specialized that maybe in mycorrhizae, they're so specialized in mycorrhizae that they're restricted their distribution because of that. But Nigel talked a little bit at odds about that in this meeting. And then pollinators, of course, can be, there is some evidence that pollinators can restrict the distribution of some orchids. And this is what I'm going to focus on, is the plant-pollinator interaction, and ask kind of a general question: are plant-pollinator interactions non-transferable? So now we're going to get to the, actually there's not much science in this, but the tale of two species. In fact, I guess we've heard these two species mentioned a number of times: Dendrobium cruminatum and Arundina graminifolia. And we'll start with our dear Dendrobium, which is known as the pigeon orchid. It is native to, well, from India on east to the Philippines and to South China. It is an epiphytic species, and its biology is just wonderful. Terrible to work with because they're a mass flowering thing. Oh, great, lots of flowers. Well, the problem is you never quite know when the temperature drops enough, which will trigger 9 days later a mass flowering event. And so I rely on people calling me up and say, "Hey, Jim, they're in flower right now." And so I jump in my car, go wherever they are, and look at them. Anyway, all plants in the neighborhood will flower simultaneously, and in their native habitat, they are pollinated by Apis cerana. And Apis cerana is pretty much like Apis mellifera, just slightly smaller bee than Apis mellifera. And then there's a recent report that says that fruit set in Singapore is like 79%. And I go, holy smokes. But then I talked to Tim about this, and Tim says, well, just a couple days ago, and he says, well, you know, it depends on which flowering episode. Sometimes there's not much fruit set going on. So there's a lot of variation in that apparently, but it can be very high. Okay, in the invasive range, and what I mean by the invasive range are essentially two places that I've been playing around, Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And you know, here's some stuff that I pull out of my hat. They do produce nectar, so this is not a deceptive species. And in both of these places, in Puerto Rico and Hawaii, they are pollinated by Apis mellifera. And they have a grand old time doing that. Here's, come back. There it is. You know, there's an Apis, a lovely plant in my backyard. For scientific purposes only. And they are apparently self-incompatible. But the fruit set is actually very low. We're not talking about, you know, 79% fruit set. I haven't seen anything near that yet. Okay, in the invasive range, you know, it's kind of odd. It's only begun to be spreading fairly recently. You know, in Hawaii, they've been growing orchids for such a long time. It's really surprising that it's only in the last 10 years that this thing has started to spread from gardens. And in Puerto Rico, it's about the same amount of time. It appears that in the native habitat, they are pollinator specific, Apis cerana. But pollination services are easily transferable to these invasive sites in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Apis mellifera, of course, is an invasive species itself. Okay, so why the low fruit set? Well, there's several possible constraints here, and one of them is that these plants appear to be self-incompatible. At least I haven't been able to get fruits to form in my self-pollinations. And it could be that there's a lack of genetic diversity at these early stages of dispersal. Another one is that at least in my neighborhood, this little beetle attacks the fruits. So I get some fruits, and very often all the fruits are destroyed by the Stephoberus polita, which will munch on the flowers, which only last a day, but they can do some considerable damage in one day, and then they lay their eggs in the fruits. And then the other possibility is the mycorrhizal fungi may have only recently become available, and I actually know nothing about that. Okay, so that's the tale of one species. Now here's the tale of the other species, and that is the bamboo orchid, Arundina graminifolia, and its native distribution is actually very similar to that of Dendrobium cruminatum. But this is not an epiphyte, it is, as you've heard before, a terrestrial species, and it is self-compatible, and as Bob says, it does not offer any pollinator reward. In its native habitat, well, there's only one recent study that shows that wasps and a variety of bees from several different families are the pollinators. And fruit set is 5 to 12%, which is, you know, halfway decent for a deceptive orchid, as most of you know. Okay, in the invasive range in Hawaii, of course, you find them along these very natural habitats called roadsides, and you know, it's real easy to get to them, obviously. And then they cover a fairly broad ecological range. You can even find them right at the edge of Kilauea crater, next to the steam vents. And then what we found there is that fruit set is very high, remarkably 35%. That's just outstanding. But despite that, we didn't see any action ourselves. And then it turns out that species distribution modeling suggests that there's still some room for range expansion, even though this species has been around in Hawaii for quite a few decades. In Puerto Rico, it's a little bit different story. We have big flowered plants, and we have small flowered plants. And the small flowered plants have higher fruit set, although it's very low, than the large flowered plants. And in the large flowered plants, we have seen, after many hours of observation, a local centrus bee visiting the large flowered plants. And the centrus bee is maybe about twice the size of a honeybee. And then I suspect it is the honeybees that are visiting the small flowered plants. And the small flowered plants are about the same size as those plants that are found in Hawaii. So, you know, a couple things are going on there. And the other thing is that we did some species distribution modeling that this is just hot off the presses and probably change in a few hours, where we take the invasive range, Hawaii, and use the points in Hawaii to predict where we might expect them to, where we might expect Arundina graminifolia to be in Puerto Rico. And environmental parameters that we use there is, we chose 5 out of, I don't know, about 18 environmental parameters that that made any sense to us. And it turns out that the fit is really kind of poor for Puerto Rico. And then when you do the reverse, you take the presence points in Puerto Rico and try to apply it to Hawaii, then that's not so good either. So it seems that, and then the environmental factors that are important in one place are different from those that are important in another. So this is a possibility where you might have local adaptation, or it could be that the source populations for these things are from different areas of the native range. Okay, so the future outlook for these things, Dendrobium cruminatum is not likely to change much, at least not by pollinator-mediated selection, because the pollinators in the invasive range are pretty much the same as the pollinators in the native range. Floral traits in Arundina graminifolia, on the other hand, may respond to shifts in the pollinator pool. There's a possibility that you have selection for smaller flower plants in Puerto Rico, and so you might expect that Arundina graminifolia in Puerto Rico may change. So acquired interactions seems to be context dependent, reflecting possible hidden flexibility that facilitates orchid establishment in novel regions. So, future outlook. Questions to address is how much potential redundancy is there in the orchid family? And for those species that do have this, do they have the genetic variability to respond to change, to environmental change? And the big question, of course, is whether orchids can keep up with the change that we're seeing in our floras. So with that, that's it. Thank you very much.